Every story begins somewhere, and his began in a hallway. The year was 1998. Westbrook Middle School sat at the edge of town, a red brick building with faded paint, cracked sidewalks, and a flagpole that leaned ever so slightly, as if even the building itself was tired. To most kids, it was just school, a place of lockers, classrooms, bells, and cafeteria food. But to David Miller, it was a battlefield he never chose to fight on. Sound of sneakers squeaking on the floor, lockers slamming shut, chatter of kids. David was 12 years old, thin, quiet, the kind of boy who clutched his books tight as if they were a shield. He had dreams, small ones, simple ones, to make his mama proud, to draw superheroes in the margins of his notebook, to one day stand tall enough to not feel small. But Westbrook didn't care about his dreams, because the first thing people saw wasn't David's smile or his drawings or his kindness. The first thing they saw was his skin. David walking down the hall. A group of kids whisper. One points, then laughs. The laughter spreads like fire. They called him names, not just behind his back. No, right to his face. Words sharp as glass. Words that cut him down before he even knew how to stand tall. Look at him. Too black. Don't sit near him. And when the words weren't enough, they found other ways to remind him he didn't belong. A shove into a locker, a spitball aimed at his neck, a trip that sent his books flying across the floor. And each time, the laughter came. Loud, cruel. Laughter that filled the hall and told David, "You are alone here." What makes cruelty worse is silence, because the teachers saw. They saw the way David flinched, the way he picked himself up off the floor. They saw the bruises that weren't always made with fists. But silence. Silence can be the loudest violence of all. David would look up sometimes, just hoping, praying that someone would step in. A teacher, a counselor, anyone. But their eyes would shift away. Their footsteps would quicken. Their mouths would stay closed. And so he learned a cruel truth. The world doesn't always break you with hatred. Sometimes it breaks you with indifference. David sits alone in the cafeteria. Other kids laugh across the room. He picks at his food. Every lunch was the same. David at a table by himself, his tray untouched, his head down. He heard the whispers. He heard the snickers. He even heard the word janitor tossed like an insult, as if his future had already been written in dirt and mop water. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that one day, that very word would become his crown. But at 12 years old, sitting in a cold cafeteria, it felt like a curse. If you've ever been 12 and felt invisible, you know the weight David carried. If you've ever been 12 and felt like the world had already made up its mind about you, then you know what it's like to walk in his shoes. This was David Miller, a boy alone in a hallway, a boy the world tried to erase before he even had the chance to write his story. But here's the thing about stories. No matter how many times they tried to silence him, no matter how many times they tried to bury him beneath their laughter, David's story refused to end in that hallway, because one day that same hallway would remember his name, not as the boy they mocked, not as the boy they ignored, but as the man they could never break. The days at Westbrook felt endless. For most students, school was a place of friendships, of laughter, of notes passed between desks. For David, it was a battlefield. Each morning, he tied his shoes, not with excitement, but with dread. He brushed his hair not in front of a mirror, but in front of a cracked piece of glass nailed to his bedroom wall. And as he stood by the door, his mother, worn from 2 jobs, would place her hand on his shoulder. "Keep your head up, baby," she'd whisper. Her voice carried hope, but David carried silence. Footsteps echoing in the school hallway. The sound of kids laughing, then abruptly cutting off when David walks past. He had learned how to walk without making noise, how to keep his eyes low, how to eat quickly, quietly, alone. Because in Westbrook's halls, every glance was a weapon. Every laugh carried his name, even when it didn't. Every day he was reminded that his skin was not just skin, but a target. Sudden, sharp sound, books hitting the floor, laughter erupting. "Watch where you're going." The words weren't spoken, they were spat. David bent down, his hands trembling as he picked up his books. He didn't meet their eyes. He never did. Around him, sneakers squeaked on polished floors. A circle of faces looked down at him, not one offering help, not one breaking the silence. To them, he was invisible, unless they needed someone to mock. And so, David discovered places the others ignored. an empty stairwell, a bench behind the gym, and most of all, the janitor's closet. At first, it was a hiding place, a small, dim room with peeling paint, a bucket in the corner, and the faint scent of bleach. But to David, it became something more. It became a sanctuary. He would sit on an overturned bucket, knees tucked to his chest, sketching quietly in the margins of his notebooks. Superheroes, warriors, kings, men with dark skin, broad shoulders, eyes filled with fire, men who looked like him, heroes that no one at Westbrook would ever believe in, except David. In that closet, David wasn't the boy who was pushed. He wasn't the boy who was laughed at. He wasn't the boy who walked alone. In that closet, he was everything they told him he couldn't be. In cafeteria, noises swell, kids laughing, trays clattering. David sits at the far end of a table, eating slowly. A group of students whisper and snicker as they walk by. The sound fades, leaving silence. But the closet was not the world. Outside its walls, silence reigned. The teachers saw the shoves but turned away. The counselors noticed the absences but never asked why. Even the lunch lady, who knew more than she let on, chose not to intervene. For a child, silence is louder than words. For David, it was abandonment. It told him he was alone. But here is the part they never understood. David's silence wasn't weakness. His bowed head wasn't surrender. His quiet wasn't defeat. Every time he bent to pick up his books, every time he walked away from a fight, every time he chose not to answer back, he was building something inside of him. Patience, resilience, a fire that burns slow but steady. Pain has a way of shaping us. And for David, every insult was a hammer. Every shove was a chisel. Every silence from the adults was a strike of fire. And in the middle of that cruelty, something began to form. Not a boy defined by suffering, but a man defined by endurance. He didn't know it yet. But those years in the hallways of Westbrook were planting seeds. Seeds of resilience, seeds of dignity, seeds that would one day grow into the very thing they mocked him for, a janitor. Yes, a janitor. Not the insult they spit with laughter, but a title he would one day wear with pride. Because dignity is not in the work you do, it is in how you endure. And in the darkness of that closet, David Miller began to dream, not of revenge, not of recognition, but of survival. And for now, survival was enough. For years, David had perfected the art of being invisible. Invisible in the hallways, invisible in the classrooms, invisible at lunch tables that stretched wide but had no seat for him. But invisibility has a cost. It swallows you whole. It tells you that your voice doesn't matter, that your pain is not worth naming, that you are better off existing quietly in the shadows. And David had believed that lie until the day the spark appeared. In cafeteria, noise swells, laughter, trays clattering, sneakers squeaking. Then the sharp clatter of a plastic tray hitting the ground. Silence follows, pierced by snickers and whispers. It happened in the cafeteria. David was carrying his tray, just a sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. The same lunch he always picked because it was safe, predictable, unremarkable. As he walked past the crowded tables, a foot shot out from under one. He didn't see it. He didn't have to. The tray flew from his hands, food scattering across the floor. The sound was loud, too loud. The cafeteria froze, and then laughter, a wave of it, cruel, sharp, piercing. Mocking voices echo. Random guy said, "Careful, janitor, don't slip on your mop water." Random guy 2 said in, "Better clean that up before you get in trouble." The word again, janitor. They had been calling him that for months now, ever since someone had overheard his mother mention she cleaned houses for a living. To them, janitor was the ultimate insult. To David, it was a reminder of the box they wanted to trap him in. Normally, he would have lowered his head, cleaned up the mess, and escaped back to the safety of the closet. But something inside of him shifted that day. Maybe it was the way the laughter rolled on longer than usual. Maybe it was the way no teacher stepped forward, even as his milk dripped across the tile. Or maybe it was because he was tired. Tired of carrying silence, tired of carrying shame that wasn't his. So David stood still. He didn't pick up the tray. He didn't reach for the sandwich. He didn't bend, didn't bow, didn't shrink. He simply stood. For the first time, he met their eyes. In cafeteria, whispers fade into a hush, as if the room is holding its breath. It was only a few seconds, 10, maybe 15. But in those seconds, the entire cafeteria felt it. The boy who never looked up was staring back. The boy who never spoke was daring them to keep laughing. And in his silence there was something new. Not fear, not surrender, but defiance. Finally, David bent down, but not to clean. He picked up the carton of milk, set it on the tray, and walked away. He didn't hurry. He didn't hide. He walked slow. Every step was heavy, deliberate, echoing against the tile floor. And though the laughter started again, uneasy, awkward, weaker this time, something had changed. They had seen his eyes. And once you see fire, you cannot pretend it was never there. Later that day, David sits in the janitor's closet, breathing hard, the faint scratch of pencil on paper. Back in his closet, David sketched again, but this time, the hero he drew wasn't untouchable, invincible, larger than life. This time, the hero looked tired, bruised, weary, but his head was lifted, his eyes unbroken. And in his hand, he held no sword, no shield, just an empty tray. Because sometimes resistance doesn't look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like refusing to bend. That small act didn't change the world. The taunts didn't stop. The stares didn't vanish. The cruelty didn't disappear. But inside David, something had shifted. He realized he didn't have to win the war all at once. He only had to survive each battle. And each battle could be fought in silence, in defiance, in dignity. This was the spark, not the explosion, not the fire, but the spark. The moment David stopped being only a survivor, the moment he began quietly, steadily to resist. Defiance is never free. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, carries a cost. And for David, that cost came quickly. The day after the cafeteria, the air shifted. The stares were sharper, the whispers louder, the laughter meaner. It was as if his silence, his refusal to bow, had disturbed something fragile. And now the world around him was determined to put him back in his place. It began with his books. One morning he opened his locker to find them ripped apart, pages shredded, drawings crumpled and tossed into the trash. The sketches, the heroes he had drawn in secret, scattered on the floor, stomped on by sneakers that walked away laughing. Sound, cruel laughter echoes faintly. Not so tough now, are you, Janitor? Guess your little comics couldn't save you. David gathered the pieces quietly. No teacher noticed, no classmate cared. He carried the torn pages back to his closet, each scrap heavier than the last. And when he closed the door behind him for the first time, he let himself break. In the solitude of that broom closet, David cried. Cried for his broken books. Cried for his silenced voice. Cried for the weight of being 16 years old and already feeling like the world was stacked against him. Soft, somber piano begins, very slow. But tears, too, are a kind of resistance. Because when you cry, you declare that your pain is real. You refuse to numb it. You refuse to let the world convince you that it doesn't matter. And when David finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, he picked up a pencil. On one torn page, he drew again. This time, not a hero, but a boy. A boy standing in a storm, lightning cracking above him, wind trying to tear him apart. And though the storm raged, the boy stood, bent, yes, bruised, yes, but standing. Scene shifts. Hallway again. Sound. Sneakers squeaking, whispers rising. The retaliation grew worse. In the hallway, shoulders slammed into him harder. In the classrooms, his answers were mocked, even when they were correct. At lunch, his seat was pulled out before he could sit, sending him crashing to the floor. And every time the word returned, janitor. Not just from students anymore, teachers too used it. Casually, carelessly, as if it were his name. Janitor, clean that up. Janitor, don't be late. Janitor, quiet down. A word meant to strip him of dignity, to remind him where they believed he belonged, to chain him to a role he had never chosen. But what they didn't know was this. Every insult was fuel. Every shove, every whisper, every cruel laugh, wood to a fire they could not see burning. At night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of his mother, who scrubbed floors until her hands cracked, who came home exhausted, but still asked how his day was. He thought of his little sister, who looked at him with wide eyes, believing he was strong even when he felt weak. And in those quiet hours, David made a promise. He would not let them break him. Not completely. If they wanted him silent, he would whisper. If they wanted him broken, he would bend but not shatter. If they wanted him invisible, he would leave behind marks they could not erase. Scene, David sketching late at night. The sound of pencil scratching paper, soft but determined. So he drew. Every night he filled the pages with the storm. Heroes bent but unbroken. figures standing tall against shadows twice their size, a boy with a tray in his hand staring back at the world. His closet became his gallery, each wall lined with drawings, proof that he existed, proof that he would not disappear, proof that his story was worth telling, even if no one else listened. Music rises slightly, with faint hope beneath the heaviness. They thought the retaliation would bury him, but instead it planted something, a seed, the seed of resilience, the seed of quiet rage transformed into creation, the seed of a story that would not end here. David Miller had been tested. He had been mocked, broken, pushed into corners, but he was still here, still standing, still drawing. And what no one realized, not yet, was that storms don't just break. Sometimes, storms build. By the time winter settled over the school, David Miller had learned how to endure. He walked through hallways heavy with whispers. He sat in classrooms where his name was replaced with Janitor. He ate his lunches in silence, the noise of laughter and mockery echoing just beyond reach. But in the quiet, he drew. And in his drawings, he found something they couldn't touch. Each line was a rebellion, each sketch a refusal to disappear. But David never imagined his drawings, his private storm, would one day be seen. Scene shifts, classroom, teacher calling out names, sound of footsteps, a chair scraping, tension builds. It happened in English class. The teacher, Mrs. Carter, asked the students to write a short essay. Something simple. "Tell me," she said, "about a hero." The class groaned, unimpressed. But David's mind lit up. He thought of his mother, her hands raw from cleaning, but her eyes fierce with love. He thought of his sister, innocent and bright. He thought of the figures he had drawn night after night, bending, breaking, but never giving in. And when the essay was finished, David did something he had never dared before. He attached a drawing to it. A boy standing in a storm, a boy holding on, a boy refusing to be erased. The next day, Mrs. Carter asked David to stay after class. For a moment, panic rose in his chest. Had he done something wrong? Was this another punishment? But when the last student left, Mrs. Carter placed his paper on the desk, the essay, the drawing, and she said only 3 words. Pause, softer tone, like a whisper. "David, this matters." Soft piano enters, warm but fragile. For the first time, someone saw him, not as a janitor, not as a joke, not as an outcast, but as a voice, as a creator, as a boy with something to say. Mrs. Carter's office, papers rustling, drawer opening, sound of a stapler click. Mrs. Carter asked if she could keep the essay. David hesitated. His art had always been hidden, a shield he clung to in secret. But when he looked at her, he saw no mockery, no pity, only respect. And so he nodded. A week later, David's drawing appeared on the bulletin board outside the classroom. Pinned between essays and posters, his storm stood tall, and beneath it, the words he had written, "A hero is not someone who never falls. A hero is someone who stands again." Sound, footsteps in hallway, murmurs rising. The students noticed, some laughed. Who cares about janitor boy's scribbles? But not everyone laughed. A few paused, a few stared longer than they meant to, a few felt something stir, a reflection, a flicker, a truth too raw to dismiss. Scene, after class, a student lingers. Sound of hesitation, then a voice, quiet, nervous. Student, "Hey, David, I liked your drawing." Pause. Silence heavy. Then the faintest sound of David exhaling. It was one voice. Just one. But to David, it was everything. Because in that single moment, the weight he carried shifted. Not gone, not erased, but lighter. That night, David drew again. Not in despair, not in anger, but in quiet triumph. He drew a boy standing in a storm, and behind him, for the first time, a flicker of light breaking through the clouds. Scene fades. Soft sound of pencil scratching fades into silence. It was a small thing, a teacher's kindness, a single student's words. But small sparks ignite great fires, and though David didn't know it yet, this was the beginning of something larger. Because resilience is contagious, and hope, once seen, cannot be unseen. For a moment, it seemed as if David had turned a corner. His drawing on the bulletin board became a quiet symbol, something fragile, something real. And though not everyone noticed, though most still walked past, he noticed. He carried that spark with him, tucked deep inside. But sparks, when seen, can be dangerous, because not everyone wants the light. Scene, hallway chatter shifts darker, mocking laughter, harsh whispers. The bullies noticed. To them, David's drawing wasn't art, it was defiance, and defiance had to be punished. Footsteps approaching, locker slamming shut violently. Oh, bully one. Hey, Picasso, think you're special now? Think you're more than just a janitor's kid? Yeah. Let's see how special you look without your little scribbles. They tore his sketchbook, pages ripped, crumpled, falling like broken wings to the floor. Months of drawings, his private escape destroyed in seconds. Sound, faint tearing, then silence. Music, low, mournful piano chords. David stood frozen. He wanted to shout, he wanted to fight. But the words caught in his throat, strangled by fear and the weight of years of silence. And so he bent down, gathering scraps of paper while laughter echoed down the hallway. But something was different this time, because as David reached for the torn pages, a hand reached too. Student, awkward. Here, let me help. It wasn't Mrs. Carter this time. It wasn't a teacher. It was another student, a classmate, not a bully, not an enemy, just someone who saw the cruelty for what it was. And in that small act, David realized something. The storm was shifting. Scene, classroom later. Chairs scraping, faint murmurs, Mrs. Carter addressing class. But word spread. By the end of the week, everyone seemed to know about the drawing, and while some rolled their eyes, others began to whisper. Not all the whispers were cruel. Some carried a different tone. Curiosity, respect, even admiration. But the louder the whispers grew, the angrier the bullies became. Because power built on fear cannot stand the rise of respect. Scene, cafeteria. Sound of trays for chatter. Sudden hush, then voices rising. Bully one. Look at him, Mr. Hero. Thinks he's better than us. Thinks he's some kind of inspiration. Newsflash, janitor boy. You'll never be anything. You'll clean up after us forever. Pause, silence, then faint sound of murmurs, not all laughter this time. Some uncomfortable, some disapproving. For the first time, not everyone joined in. Some stayed quiet, some looked away. And silence in that moment was louder than laughter. Scene shifts, nighttime, sound of pencil scratching, faint sighs, music, soft, slow strings. That night, David drew again. The storm was darker now, the clouds heavier, the figures of bullies loomed larger. But this time he drew something new. A boy, small, fragile, was not alone. Behind him, a faint silhouette, not fully formed, not strong, but present. A figure bending down, helping him gather what was broken. For the first time in his life, David understood. He wasn't invisible anymore. Yes, the cruelty remained. Yes, the bullies still circled like wolves. But in the cracks of cruelty, something else had begun to grow. Compassion. And compassion, like hope, is contagious. Scene, morning. School bell rings. Students shuffle in, quiet but steady. The storm was not over. If anything, it was about to grow fiercer. But David had learned something vital. They could rip his drawings. They could mock his name. They could spit their poison in the hallways. But they could not erase the truth that was spreading, that he mattered. And when a voice has been silenced too long, its echo becomes unstoppable. Every morning, David began the same way. The smell of bleach, the rattle of a mop bucket, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. It was a rhythm he knew too well, a rhythm built from invisibility. But now something inside him was shifting. Because for the first time, David realized invisibility was a choice he no longer wanted to make. In hallway, sounds of lockers slamming, shoes squeaking, faint whispers. That's him, the one who drew the mural. The whispers followed him. Not always cruel, not always kind, but constant. And as much as David wanted to shrink into the background, something deep inside told him it was time to step forward. Scene, art classroom. Papers rustling, pencil scratching, Mrs. Carter's voice faint in background, encouraging students. He began to draw again, not just in secret, not just at night, but in class, in daylight, where others could see. Every line he put to paper was an act of defiance, every stroke of the pencil a quiet rebellion. Hey, could you draw something for me? Like my dog or my little brother? David's hand shook, not from fear, but from something else. Recognition, respect, worth. In cafeteria, loud chatter. Suddenly, tray slams down, the bullies return. Bully one. Well, look at this, Mr. Artist, signing autographs now? Don't forget us when you're famous. Oh wait, you'll be too busy mopping floors. Laughter echoes. But then, silence. A few students don't laugh. One voice cuts in. Shut up. Nobody's laughing anymore. Pause. Cafeteria goes quiet. The bullies freeze, shocked. A tense silence stretches. It was small, barely more than a whisper. But in that moment, it was thunder. The balance had shifted. The bullies felt it. David felt it. And silence was no longer his enemy after school. Sounds of sneakers crunching on gravel, faint breeze, David walking home. For the first time in years, David walked with his head higher. The weight was still there, the memories of slurs, the sting of ridicule, the ache of being less than. But beneath the pain, a new strength was rising, a strength born not of fists, but of courage. That night, he drew not just storms, but sunlight breaking through them. He drew not just faceless shadows, but faces of classmates kind and brave. And at the center of it all, a boy no longer bowed, but standing tall. In morning assembly, school gym echoing voices, bleachers creaking. And then came the moment that changed everything. The principal announced a student art showcase. Volunteers were invited to display their work for the school, for parents, for the community. Eyes turned to David, some curious, some mocking, some hopeful. And in that silence, a single question rose. Would he dare? Fear clawed at him. Doubt screamed in his chest. What if they laughed? What if they tore his work again? What if this time no one stood with him? But another voice, quieter, steadier, whispered back. What if they listened? In Janitor's closet again, echo of mop bucket rolling. David's father's voice faint, memory-like. David's father, son, your hands will always build something. Don't let the world tell you what it can't be. David knew then. This was more than art. This was his stand. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to be seen. In classroom bulletin board, rustle of paper, thumbtacks clicking, a large colorful poster is pinned up. Students gather around. It began with a poster, bright colors, bold letters. Spring Art Showcase, a celebration of student voices. Some barely noticed, some shrugged. But to David, it was more than a poster. It was a door to a world he had been locked out of, a door he wasn't sure he had the courage to walk through. David at the back of class, staring at the poster. His chest tightened. Memories of laughter, of cruel jokes pressed down on him like hands on his shoulders. He remembered torn sketches. He remembered whispers, the janitor's boy. But behind that weight was something new, a flicker, a spark, the memory of a classmate's voice in the cafeteria. A single word spoken in his defense, enough. For the first time in his life, someone had said it for him, and now he had to decide if he would say it for himself, in hallway. Students whispering, some looking at David. A bully's voice cuts through, sharp and mocking. Bully 1. Hey Picasso, heard there's a showcase. Gonna draw us cleaning toilets? Or maybe a mop with your face on it? Laughter echoes, but weaker than before. A few kids roll their eyes, some mutter in disapproval. The bully looks unsettled. The jeers still came, but they were quieter now. The crowd was shifting, the balance was changing, and the bullies, they felt it. After school, janitor's closet, the smell of bleach and floor wax. David sits on an upturned bucket, sketchbook in his lap. His father enters, wiping sweat from his brow. You're working hard in here. What's on your mind, son? David. They're having an art showcase. I want to enter. Silence. Then the sound of his father's breath, long, slow, heavy with both worry and pride. Then you do it. You put your work out there. Don't let fear steal your gift. His father's words struck deeper than any insult ever could. Because for years his father had bent under the weight of humiliation, but he had never let it crush his spirit. Now he was passing that torch. He drew until his hands ached. He drew until the lines blurred through tired eyes. He drew not just what he saw, but what he felt. The ache of loneliness, the sting of shame, the fire of defiance, the fragile bloom of hope. Every sketch was a piece of his soul. Every drawing, a step closer to freedom. Cafeteria a week later. Flyers handed out. Students buzz with excitement about the showcase. David sits at a table, sketchbook half hidden. A classmate approaches. Classmate, hey, you're entering, right? You should. People need to see what you can do. David hesitates, clutching the sketchbook tighter. His silence stretches. Then slowly he nods. The decision was made, quietly, softly, but with a weight that could not be undone. David would stand, not with fists, not with anger, but with art in shadowy corner of hallway. Bullies whispering, tone darker, bitter. Bully 2. He thinks he's gonna be in the showcase? No way, we'll make sure of it. Yeah, let him bring his little doodles. We'll tear them apart before anyone sees. But where light rises, shadows gather. And as David's courage grew, so did their cruelty. They could feel him breaking free of their grip, and they would not let go quietly. Night before the showcase, David sits at his desk, finished drawing in hand. It's powerful, filled with symbolism. Chains breaking, light piercing through shadows, a lone figure standing tall. It was more than a drawing. It was his story, his father's story. The story of every whispered insult, every slammed locker, every tear shed in silence. It was pain and hope, woven into graphite and paper. And tomorrow, the world would see it. He didn't know what awaited him. Applause, laughter, destruction. But one truth was clear. He was no longer hiding. The boy who once swept halls in silence was ready to stand in the light. Early morning, the school gymnasium. Folding tables set up, white sheets cover them. Teachers move briskly, arranging art supplies. Sunlight pours through high windows, casting golden light across the polished floor. The morning of the showcase arrived. Excitement hummed through the halls like electricity. Posters were hung, projects polished. Students bustled with nervous laughter. But in the heart of it all, David walked alone, carrying not just a drawing, but his voice. David clutches his sketchbook to his chest as he walks down the hall. His sneakers squeak faintly on the linoleum floor. His eyes dart, nervous but determined. His father's words echo in his mind. Don't let fear steal your gift. But as he entered the gym, fear had already gathered. Not in the open, not with laughter, but in whispers, in shadows, and in the eyes of those who still wanted to see him fall. A wide shot of students placing their artwork on tables, bright paintings, sculptures, posters. David kneels at an empty corner table. He carefully pulls his drawing from the sketchbook, smoothing it flat. His piece was different. No bright colors, no polished edges. It was raw, stark, chains breaking. A figure small, alone, standing tall against a wall of shadows. A cry of defiance and of hope. Two bullies lean against the bleachers watching. Their voices are hushed, sharp, dripping with malice. There it is, his masterpiece. Bully 2, pathetic. He really thinks anyone's gonna clap for that? No one's gonna clap, because no one's gonna see it. Their footsteps echo as they slip closer when no one is looking. The showcase was meant to lift voices, but for some, silencing him was the only goal. In cafeteria later that day, students buzzing, rehearsing for the evening's event. David eats quietly at a table, sketchbook shut, unaware. Meanwhile, back in the gym. While David dreamed of courage, his art was torn. Split down the center, ripped not just in paper, but in spirit. The bullies didn't just want to ruin a drawing. They wanted to remind him he didn't belong. Late afternoon. The gym buzzes as parents arrive. Teachers smile. Students beam with pride beside their projects. David rushes in, dressed neatly, eyes bright with nervous excitement. He walks quickly to his table. Then his steps falter. Silence. And there it was, destroyed. The chains he had drawn shredded. The figure slashed in half. The hope ripped from the page. He stood frozen, hands trembling, the laughter of memory rushing back louder than the cheers around him. In blurred sounds, students greeting parents, clapping, chatting, but David hears only echoes of bullies from the past. Whispers, janitor's boy, mop head, nobody. It was all back. Every cruel word, every slammed locker, every night he told himself he didn't matter. All back in one torn piece of paper. Seeing Mrs. Carter notices. She hurries to David, her voice firm but gentle. David, what happened? Who did this? David shakes his head, voice broken low. I don't belong here. I shouldn't have tried. He crumples the paper, moving to leave. But Mrs. Carter grips his shoulder, steady, refusing to let him go. Miss, no. You listen to me. Your voice matters. Don't let them steal it from you. Not tonight. Silence. David breathes heavily. His eyes flicker to the crowd. Parents smiling, students proud, lights glowing. He swallows hard. His father's face flashes in his mind, weary but strong, bent over a mop yet unbroken. The bullies had torn paper, but they had not torn his voice. And in that moment, David made a choice. Spotlight sound, microphone feedback. David steps slowly onto the stage. Whispers ripple through the crowd, some curious, some doubtful. He holds the torn drawing in his hands, edges jagged, fragile. David, trembling at first, then growing stronger. This was my art. It's torn, it's broken, just like I've felt for years. Murmurs in the crowd, a hush deepens. David steadies himself, raising the paper. But even torn, it tells a story, because I've been called names, laughed at, pushed down, and every time I thought maybe they were right, that I was less. But this, he holds the torn drawing high. This is me, broken, but still standing, still here, and I won't be silent anymore. Silence lingers, then a single clap, then another. Slowly, the gym erupts in applause. Some cheer, some rise to their feet. Parents nod, moved. Mrs. Carter beams, tears in her eyes. The bullies shrink in the corner, pale, silent, powerless. The paper was torn, but his spirit was not. And in that moment, David's voice, a voice silenced for so long, rose louder than the laughter of his enemies. He was no longer just the janitor's boy, no longer just a shadow. He was an artist. He was a fighter. He was seen. The applause still echoes. The torn drawing in David's hands trembles, but his grip is firm. His chest rises and falls as though the air itself is lighter than it's ever been. That night, in a gymnasium filled with art, the greatest masterpiece wasn't on paper. It was a boy's courage, a voice no longer silent. David stood not as broken, but as whole. For the first time, those who had mocked him, those who had pushed him down, saw something they couldn't erase. Strength, truth, resilience. Later that night, the showcase ends. Students pack up projects. The gym empties slowly. David stands alone at his table, folding the torn drawing carefully, smoothing the ripped edges as if holding a fragile heart. Mrs. Carter approaches, gentle, smiling through. David, tonight you taught us more than any painting on these walls ever could. David looks down, voice quiet but steady. They tore it apart, but maybe it was supposed to be this way, to show what can't be broken. Nods, her voice firm. You are not broken, David. You are a mirror. And tonight, you held it up for all of us to see. Exterior of the school at night. Streetlights glow. David walks beside his father, who carries his mop over his shoulder. Work clothes wrinkled, eyes tired. They walk slowly, the torn drawing tucked safely under David's arm. His father had always carried silence like a shield, but tonight, as they walked side by side, his silence cracked. The father stops under the streetlight. He turns, looking at his son, eyes heavy with pride, glistening with tears he rarely allowed himself to show. Father, David, I've cleaned these halls for years. People walk past me, don't see me, don't hear me. But tonight, they heard you. And when they heard you, they heard me too. David swallows hard, voice brave. I just wanted to make you proud, Dad. The father places a rough, calloused hand on his son's shoulder, steady. Son, you already have, more than you'll ever know. Time passes, the school the next day, whispers in the hallway, but this time, not cruel. Students glance at David differently. Some nod, some smile. Even those who once mocked him hesitate, their laughter gone, replaced by something they didn't want to admit, respect. It didn't erase the scars, it didn't undo the years of silence, but something had shifted. The same halls that once echoed with cruelty now carried something new, recognition. Days later, the principal calls David into the office. A poster sits on the desk. At the top, Student Voices Art Initiative. His torn drawing's been photocopied, enlarged, reassembled with tape, the jagged lines still visible. David, your art, your story, it moved people. We want to display this in the main hallway. Not fixed, not perfect, just as it is, because it tells the truth. David's eyes widen. He nods slowly, stunned. His broken piece would now hang where everyone would see it every day. What was once torn was now a banner of resilience. What was meant to silence became a voice for all who felt unheard. Weeks passing. Students stop to look at the framed drawing in the hallway. Some whisper, some nod in silence. One shy student, clutching a sketchbook, lingers by it, inspired. The bullies pass by, uneasy, unable to meet its gaze. The drawing no longer belonged to David alone. It belonged to every student who had ever been mocked, every child who had ever felt invisible, every voice silenced by cruelty. Now it spoke for them all. At home, David sits at the kitchen table sketching. His father watches quietly from the doorway, mop leaning against the wall. A faint smile crosses his tired face. He doesn't say a word, but his pride fills the room like sunlight. Healing doesn't come in one night. It comes in layers, in moments.